Tonight's event has been made possible thanks to the support of the British Fertility Society and Merck, and PET are extremely grateful to them. An all-consuming problem: how to protect patients in the fertility market. At PET, we've been tracking the fertility market for some time. When I say that, I mean watching it. We've not been investing in it, but that's not what we do with your donations, rest assured. And I looked back and I first wrote about it in 2010, having been to the fertility show and had our first exhibition stand there. I thought it'd be interesting to share what I wrote at that time. Several professional visitors to the show voiced concerns about some exhibitors, asking for evidence for some of the alternative therapies and services. They seemed surprised that some clinics were advertising treatments which, as far as they knew, they hadn't successfully carried out. Other clinics, they told me, offered tests but wouldn't change a patient's treatment. Patient visitors to our stall grumbled about the cost of treatment and nutritional supplements, and expressed confusion about widgets with questionable benefits. Now, it does grieve me to say that this state of affairs has not improved, nor is it confined to the fertility show, although we often, and I hold my hand up, I fall into this trap, we often use the fertility show as a scapegoat in this area. And at the PET stand, we give away sachets of salt, so that at the end of the day, people have a physical reminder to take all the claims and promises they hear with a pinch of salt. And we even include our own in that. We say, don't forget, apply that to us too. However, PET can't give away salt online, and in clinics where the success rates, price lists and sales and marketing services may confuse or mislead patients who are just trying to research where to spend their money, either in the clinic or when they're looking at clinics' websites. And I'm convinced that we wouldn't have the problems that we do if people had better access to state-funded treatment in England. But that's a subject for another event, really. So the Competition and Markets Authority have identified the lack of awareness about how consumer law applies in the fertility sector, and have, with the support of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, drafted guidance for the fertility sector. I'm not going to go into that in my introduction because we have someone from the CMA speaking and the HFEA speaking later. And this is to help them become more compliant with the law, this guidance. And to comply with consumer law, clinics must not provide misleading information to patients or fail to provide all the relevant material information they need to make informed decisions. Now, a lot of these words in that last sentence make the ex-lawyer in me quite nervous. And I hope that this guidance is not going to see clinics looking to lawyers for workarounds and loopholes, rather than embracing the spirit of what is intended here, which is improving the decision-making process for patients. Don't get me wrong, I'm really supportive of what the CMA is trying to do here. So tonight we'll hear about the draft guidance and what people in the sector think of it. We have 5 super speakers: Dr. Louise Strong, Clare Ettinghausen, Dr. Raj Mathur, Mark Wilcox and Katy Lindemann.
I work in the consumer protection team at the CMA, as Sarah said, and I'm going to begin by outlining who the CMA is for those of you who aren't familiar with us as an organisation and what we are doing in this sector. So the CMA is the UK's primary competition and consumer authority. We were set up about 6 years ago now after a merger of the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission, and we have various powers to tackle market conditions and market practices that have the effect of disadvantaging consumers and preventing them from being able to make effective decisions. These powers include being able to take enforcement action against particular businesses which we think have unfair terms or unfair commercial practices, and producing guidance for businesses to help clarify their consumer law obligations and promote compliance. And recently we've done that in the higher education sector for example, and in the care home sector. And that's what we're doing here in the fertility sector. We're producing guidance on consumer law. We published a draft of that guidance for consultation back at the start of November, and the consultation process is still open, and we're keen to hear from as many stakeholders as we can as part of that process. It's worth me saying what we're not doing, and we're not a regulator of the fertility sector. That's the role of the HFEA. We're not introducing new regulations or standards here. What we're doing is setting out, as an expert body in consumer law, our interpretation of how existing consumer law applies in this unique sector. I want to emphasise at the outset that the CMA appreciates the extremely valuable service that fertility clinics provide. For those buying fertility treatment, there are likely to be few, if any, purchasers that they consider to be more important. And we know that many patients do have a positive experience of the clinic where they have treatment, including patients who have unsuccessful treatment. So why are we producing guidance? Well, consumer law protects consumers in their dealings with traders, and that's across all sectors. And fertility clinics are traders for the purposes of consumer law, and therefore consumer law protects fertility patients in their dealings with clinics. These are not new obligations on clinics. Yet despite the fact that they're not new obligations on clinics, we found in our initial conversations with stakeholders and research into the sector that there appeared to be low levels of awareness that consumer law did apply in the sector. And that's both on the part of clinics, but also on the part of patients who think of themselves primarily as patients rather than consumers. Compliance with consumer law is not only important for protecting patients, it's also important for maintaining the reputation of the sector, for supporting open and fair competition between clinics, and for ensuring, in other words, that the clinics that play by the rules aren't disadvantaged by the clinics that don't. In our view, compliance with consumer law should help to address some of the concerns that we have identified in the sector, and these include, for example, patients not being able to make effective comparisons between clinics on price because of the way that some clinics present misleadingly low headline prices, missing out essential elements of treatment and their cost, or the way that some clinics provide partial or misleading information on their success rates. And there's a few other examples there. So what does consumer law require clinics to do? Well, it requires clinics to provide key information upfront so that patients can make informed decisions about which treatments to have, where to have those treatments, and whether to have treatment at all. We set out in the draft guidance the information that we think is key at the different stages of the consumer journey, and that's one of the areas where we've sought feedback from stakeholders to make sure that other people in the sector are in agreement that we've got the right information that is likely to constitute that key information. Consumer law also means that clinics must not mislead patients or act otherwise unfairly towards them, and that's either by act or by omission. And that obligation applies both before as well as after a patient enters into a contract with a patient. It also means that clinics need to ensure that their contracts with patients are fair and that their contract terms are transparent. Finally, it means that clinics need to consider the difficult circumstances which people tend to find themselves in when they're making decisions about fertility treatment. And there are a variety of different factors that can make patients vulnerable when buying fertility treatment. And these are some of illustrative examples of those, and they're based largely from our research with patients last year and our conversations with stakeholders, including patient representative groups. So firstly, this is a complex purchase involving estimations of probability and risk, and we know they're concepts that consumers tend to find difficult across different markets, and this one's no different. It's also a purchase where outcomes are, by definition, uncertain. It's the nature of the treatment. It's also the case that by the time patients arrive at the door of a fertility clinic, many have been trying for a baby for many months, if not years, and this can leave a significant emotional impact on the patient and their partner. In the UK, most patients are not used to buying healthcare, particularly directly from a provider rather than through an insurance company. And there are significant information asymmetries about treatment that exist between those offering the treatment and those deciding whether to buy it or not. And layered on top of that, you've got, on the part of most patients, a natural deference towards medical professions where they can feel uncomfortable challenging, or certainly some patients can feel uncomfortable challenging medical professionals. Another theme that came through quite strongly in our research with patients is the idea of regret aversion, and patients wanted to do all they can to avoid the feeling in the future that they hadn't done everything they could at the time, that if only they'd not done that, or if only they hadn't just not done that, then the outcome of the cycle might have turned out differently. So patients want to do everything, patients want to feel they've done everything they can as part of that treatment cycle. We know that cost really matters to patients, yet we also know, and patient groups have emphasised this to us, that patients can feel uncomfortable raising issues of cost with clinics. For example, because they feel it might appear that they don't want a baby enough if they're focusing on issues around cost. And finally, the nature of treatment means that once the cycle is underway, even if a patient is very unhappy with their experience of the clinic, it's unlikely they will want to walk away and abandon that cycle of treatment, and probably impossible for them to change clinic mid-treatment. There's a couple of final points I want to make before moving on to outline our next steps as part of the consultation process. And the first is that we're not seeking to be very prescriptive or exhaustive in the guidance. There are a few exceptions where, and for example, when we talk about key information, where we are trying to be a bit more exhaustive or prescriptive, but for the most part, we're not seeking to do that. Consumer law is principle-based, and our objective is to help clinics understand and be able to interpret and comply with those broad principles. The guidance, the draft guidance, is already 70 pages long. And to do this, we look to provide some clear examples of practices that are likely to raise concern on consumer law, but they're not, all the practices that might fall into this category. A key focus for us is ensuring consumers are properly informed and can make appropriate decisions in relation to clinics and treatments. And my other point is that our guidance specifically considers consumer law as it applies to fertility clinics. But I want to emphasise tonight, and we do this in the draft guidance, and it will be in the final guidance too, that consumer law protects patients in their interactions with all traders active in the fertility sector, whether that's providers of multi-cycle packages or egg banks or sperm banks, or those offering complementary treatments alongside the fertility treatment itself. And we want to encourage all those other traders to read the guidance and consider it and the relevant consumer law principles as it applies to them, because they are on the hook for consumer law, just like fertility clinics themselves. In terms of next steps, we last week extended, in light of the COVID crisis escalating again, the written response, the deadline for written responses to the consultation process. So that's now the 29th of January. If you Google CMA, IVF, consumer law, you'll find your way to the home pages, and there's the draft guidance alongside a consultation document which sets out a series of questions where we're particularly keen to hear from stakeholders. We've had 4 stakeholder events in December, which were very helpful and have given us a lot of things to go away and think about, and we encourage as many people as possible to submit consultation responses. You can respond to as many or as few questions as you wish as part of that. We will be publishing the final guidance for clinics in the spring of this year, and alongside that we will publish a shorter patient-facing document too, because we think it's really important that patients properly understand their rights under consumer law. 6 months after we publish the final guidance, we'll come back to the sector and carry out review. It may be that at that point we think enforcement action is necessary, but that's not what we're doing at this time.
Our next speaker is Clare Ettinghausen.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the HFEA perspective on this. The HFEA is the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, and I know that many of you are aware that we're the UK-wide regulator for all fertility clinics and treatments and embryo research. I'm going to just speak very briefly tonight about a few key points about the HFEA perspective on some of the things that Louise has outlined is in her draft guidance. So just by way of background, many of you will know that we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the HFEA this year. And although we've stood the time, the sector we regulate has obviously changed dramatically over the 30 years. We like to think that the original Warnock vision of a bargain between science and society still stands. And indeed, it's a privilege for anyone who works at the HFEA to deal with some of the issues we deal with every day, such as when does a life begin and who is a family. But having said that, our powers are outdated and introduced in a different market from today. The work that Louise has outlined is really relevant and useful, we think, for both clinics and patients. And as much as we may agree or disagree with this, the overwhelming majority of patients in the UK are now paying for treatment. And this is something that in modern UK medicine, we're just not used to. So in some parts of the country, over 75% of patients are paying for treatment. In others, particularly in Scotland, it's nearer only 40%, and the rest are covered by the NHS. And I think you mentioned this in your introduction, Sarah, about whether patients are now patients or consumers. And I think it's fair to say at the HFEA that when you're paying for something, you have become a consumer, and that doesn't necessarily, that's not a negative, it's just the fact of the situation today. So in terms of what some of the issues that we're facing with at the HFEA, and I want to talk a bit about the limits of our powers in this area in a minute, is, as Louise said, all patients and indeed all medical staff want the best outcome for the patients. Patients are increasingly shopping around, looking at different clinics and seeing what they can offer them. And as we're not the price regulator, although we have a view on this, we know that without medical knowledge, and particularly at the outset of treatment, it's very hard to know what a patient should be comparing. We've got very limited powers about what is said in relation to costs and other aspects of being a consumer. The HFEA Code of Practice does outline what information patients must be given before starting treatment, including on things like cost and success rate. We know clinics have a huge amount of information on their website, but it's not always given in a way that enables patients to compare from one clinic to another. Just in terms of looking in that in a slightly more detail, over last summer, we had a quick review of what clinic websites were doing in relation to our code of practice. This wasn't with a view of what inspectors are looking at on inspection. Indeed, our inspectors, before they visit or virtually visit at the moment any clinic, do look at clinic websites and look at their compliance with our code. But when we looked at clinic websites last summer, you can see from this figure the overwhelming, almost all were non-compliant with the detail of our code of practice on what we asked for clinics to produce on success rates. So what did this mean? So some of the issues we found were, for example, there were inconsistencies with the display of age ranges. So some clinics displayed younger age groups and some older age groups. Some combined the success rates for different age groups rather than breaking them down. This meant it was really difficult for people to compare success rates from one clinic to another. And clinics use different language to talk about success. So some use positive pregnancy tests per embryo transfer or clinical pregnancy rate per embryo transfer. And unless you read the small print and then look at another website and compare that, it becomes very, very difficult to do that comparison. There was inconsistencies with the dates of data displayed. So some clinics had data for an age range from one set of months or years, and another further down the page, a different set of dates. So you weren't really sure what you were comparing. And others combined success rates for IVF and ICSI for 1 year, but then didn't combine them for another. So you were sort of not comparing like with like. And lastly, although the overwhelming majority of clinics are amazing and fantastic, there are some clinics we found on their websites, they sort of talked in very good terms about having the highest success rates and the best outcomes. And yet when we looked at the detail of their data, that wasn't quite accurate. So overall compliance with the HFEA Code of Practice is disappointingly poor. So the next question is, well, what can we do about this? Well, as I've said, the current law is really prescriptive about what we regulate, and we have very few direct regulatory levers in this area. Indeed, the law that we regulate, the HFE Act, talks about protecting the gamete and the embryo, and it talks about licensing, but there's no mention of quality of care or the patient in there. And in terms of the modern regulatory tools that other regulators have, we're considered something of a dinosaur. So what have we been doing? Well, we've been using kind of soft power, if you like. So we talk about quite a lot about, well, what is ethical for patients? And we've done a lot of work with patients, asking them to question and encourage them to question some of the things they might be offered. So the modern UK IVF market is competitive and innovative, which is fantastic. And new treatments are being developed in technology and drugs, and they provide lots of different options for patients. But at its worst, we have had patients who have been upsold treatments that are unlikely to make a big difference to their outcome. And in those cases, we really do suggest that patients ask quite critical questions of the treatment they're being offered. So in terms of what happens from now on, as Louise said, the CMA's guidance will be published later in the year, and we'll be looking to ensure that clinics that we work with, the HFEA licensed clinics, understand that that guidance and how consumer law applies to them. We also hope it will be really valuable for patients as well. As I said, as it's the 30th anniversary of the HFEA, it's a real opportunity for us to look at where we are and seeing, does our legislative framework work in the way it should today? Does it do what the public expect? I think the issues the CMA have highlighted about patient protection in this commercialised world are going to be at the very heart of some of the issues we discuss over the next year. And I very much welcome any thoughts that the audience have today and over the next 12 months as well.
Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Raj Mathur. Raj is the new chair of the British Fertility Society.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for organizing this event. Thank you for asking me to speak at it. I would like to declare my interest to start with. I work in an NHS service 4 days a week, and that service also provides self-funded fertility treatments. As Sarah has already alluded, I work sessions in a private fertility clinic in Manchester. I was involved in providing input to the CMA during the development of their guidance for fertility clinics. And I have to say, I was so impressed by the speed with which they understood not just the commercial aspects of IVF, but even the clinical aspects. And I'd also like to say that full details of my interests are available publicly to anyone who wishes to look at them at whopaysthisdoctor.org. So the British Fertility Society represents professionals who work in the field of fertility. We have over 1,100 individual members. Our members come from a range of backgrounds, from the NHS, from private clinics, from academic backgrounds, non-profits, and so on. And we include medical doctors, nurses, counselors, scientists, managers. What we don't have corporate members. So there are no clinics that are a member of the BFS, and there are no clinic chains that are a member of the BFS. There are individuals. Among the aims of the BFS is to improve the practice of healthcare professionals working in the field of fertility for the public benefit. And for that reason, the CMA guidance does fall under the aims of the BFS. However, we decided against doing a formal BFS response to this consultation for a number of reasons, primarily because we have a very diverse membership and they all have different takes and different interests and perspectives on this. And as I said, we have no corporate members. So we have allowed, or we have encouraged individual members to respond as individuals. Having said that, we very broadly do support any measure that helps patients of subfertility and protects patients from potential harm. At the same time, we do have to be careful that the measures that we support or implement don't inadvertently harm patient interests. So there are some significant positive features of the CMA guidance. At the very outset, I think it's important to acknowledge both the scope and scale of the work and the detail of the work that the CMA have put out. I think a big positive feature of the CMA guidance for clinics is that it will allow clinics to show people and to reassure clinics themselves that they're complying with consumer law. Quite important to make the point that this is not new law that is suddenly applicable to clinics. Clinics should have been doing this all the time. As far as patients are concerned, it should hopefully give them confidence that they're being treated legally and fairly. It should provide patients clarity on costs, and that should allow them to plan their treatment with more confidence. I think anything that helps patients get more clear information on different aspects of treatment is welcome. The ability to compare clinics is crucial, particularly where there is a number of competing clinics. And if any measures can be taken to improve the transparency of that, then that is a good thing. And overall, I think this guidance, if implemented properly, should help improve public confidence in the fertility sector. And I think it has the potential to improve some aspects of the patient experience. So having said all that, I think there are some potential issues with it as well. I will highlight a few that come out to me as an individual clinical practitioner. And one of the first things that comes out is that it is quite prescriptive with regard to information provision. And in some places, I think it's possibly excessively prescriptive. For instance, they use the term material information. And you're supposed to now provide material information on the potential risks and evidence-based for add-ons to patient, even when they haven't yet decided to have fertility treatment or chosen a fertility clinic at a very, very early stage. Now, on the surface, this looks like a good idea because who can argue with providing more information? But in practice, we actually don't know if provision of information at that stage is either practical. I mean, where will we provide this? On the website? I don't know, not clear how you'll properly display it, and whether it is useful, as will patients actually use it to make any decisions at that stage of their treatment journey. And the point I want to make is that information giving in a clinical context is actually quite different from information giving in a more legalistic or contractual context. Now, information giving is something doctors and nurses and other clinicians do all the time. It's an essential part of clinical care. Typically, information giving in a clinical context occurs over a period of time in using a variety of methods and a different context. The GMC has very clear expectations of clinicians in how they provide information and ensure this process is carried out appropriately. And I think that is quite different from the very prescriptive and I would say contractual way in which the CMA guidance requires us to prescribe it. For instance, I have a screenshot of the GMC guidance there. We have to take into account time and place for when they're best equipped to deal with the information that is provided with them so that you can put it into context. And simply displaying it on a website, I don't think clinically that would be the appropriate thing to do. No other, in no other field of medicine are we enjoined or required to do that. And I think if somebody randomly started displaying clinical information without context, I think that might actually amount to a violation of GMC standards. I have to make the point that information is not necessarily power. If I see too much information, I switch off. I've learned to ignore it, and I'm sure many members of the audience will have learned to ignore it. And to me, it seems that this is one of the bad things about consumer contracts. All that fine print, it is so off-putting to the ordinary person. And we really ought to think twice before we import it wholesale into clinical medicine, into IVF. And I think we do really need to think about it carefully. I think there are potential issues with providing too much information out of context to patients. And we cannot be sure that this will not affect the quality of judgments and decisions that are made by patients. Another issue that I have with the guidance is the kind of lack of clarity around whether this is guidance meant for clinics or guidance meant for clinicians. And this is true not just of this guidance, but I think of a lot of discourse around the, let me say, the market aspects or the non-clinical aspects of IVF. And people float very easily from, oh, clinics must do this, to clinicians must do this, or clinics don't do this, or clinicians don't do this. There is a difference, and we need to recognize that and take that into account. I have some quotes from the guidance there, which are in italics. To me, it's not completely clear where this refers to clinicians. Does it refer differently to clinicians who actually share care with the clinic? So they provide a sort of, let's call it a satellite IVF service with the clinic. Is it clinicians who simply refer patients to a clinic but don't actually have an interest or provide any care in that clinic? Is it clinicians who, like me, do sessions of work in another clinic without having any ownership or a similar role in that clinic? So these are all quite different scenarios. And I can't really see why the same responsibility can be said to fall on those three different groups of clinicians. And in fact, in the latter two, I find it very hard to see how you can even say that there is a contractual relationship between the doctor and patient in that scenario, which also covers IVF. I think we need much more clarity on this. And I welcome the consultation, which gives us the chance to work with the CMA to get some clarity into this. Another place where it's not clear is where the guidance refers to individuals who either own or have responsibility for managing a clinic. I think that is also vague, and I think we could try and make that clearer. One option, I suppose, could be to try and link it to the way the HFEA regulates clinics and link it to the person responsible. But again, I'm not sure of that because I think the person responsible is a really outdated concept, and I can't wait for the next review of the Act because that needs to go. So I don't have a solution, but I think we could do better than this. So in
Raj,
summary,
you're running out of time, so if you can just wrap up
okay,
quite
I will
quickly
end
now.
by saying it's a very positive step, but we risk accelerating the transformation of patients who have a caring, trusting relationship with a trusted clinician into consumers who have a purely contractual relationship with a commercial organization. And I think that is something we need to be careful of. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker now is Mark Wilcox.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to speak. As you can see from the first slide, I'm CARE's Group Medical Director. This is sort of my response and CARE's response to the guide, the CMA consultation guide that's come out. And it's interesting really that your key question at the beginning was patient or consumer, which we're all going to be voting on later. Raj referred to patients, and I will do so as well. I think it's a habit that doctors have, and I think that's part of the issue perhaps is that we don't think of our patients as consumers, and maybe we should do. So the purpose of this review, as I understand it, we've heard earlier from Louise, and just picking out a few of the elements of that as it relates to us as I see it. It is in order to give us guidance on consumer law, because as I've said, we perhaps just think about patients treating clinically and don't give sufficient thought to consumer law as it applies to pricing. And I would agree that it is difficult to compare clinics, so it could be more transparent. That's the aim, to not have unexpected additional costs and actually make the success rates a little bit more transparent. And also commenting on the proposed little evidence for the add-ons in increasing live birth rate. So under the consumer law, as I say, we haven't been very good at addressing this perhaps to date, but I think we do this naturally anyway, I would hope, that we are not to mislead patients, we are to ensure that their contracts are fair and not biased towards the provider and away from the patient. We need to consider the complexity of the whole arrangement and also the emotions that drive that and the impact of that. I don't think anybody could disagree with that, and it seems eminently sensible. But there are a number of issues, and Raj has highlighted some of these already. Now, the provision of information. What do we give, when do we give it, and how do we give it? Historically, it's changed over the years. When I was a young clinician, I tended to inform patients about their condition and what the options were. Now, it would appear that they know it all already. But of course, we need to interpret that for them. So we haven't lost our jobs yet, but we rarely give them information that they have not heard about before, and they may already have a preconceived idea about it. When does our contract actually start? Does it start at the first consultation, or does it start when they arrange to come for that consultation? Is it even before that, when they first start looking at our websites? So, and there's a number of different sorts of contracts that we enter into. There's the clinical, the consent, and the pricing. Now, a traditional consultation is required in order to make a diagnosis, present some options, agree a way forward, maybe with some investigations and possibly a treatment plan. But that all can only really occur at that consultation, and it's very difficult, as Raj was saying, to give all that information up front beforehand. Otherwise, we get into the terms and conditions, which we all just tick and accept. Should we be giving every clinical option at that stage? It would seem so from some of the wording of the consultation. Success rates, how do we present those in a fair way? If we genuinely want to present our current clinical success rates, do we present them in general terms or specific to the patient? Of course, we can't know the patient until we've met them and made a diagnosis. Do we rely on live birth rates that are published, which are therefore a year or two out of date? Or do we rely on the current clinical pregnancy rates, which have their problems? Do we publish the group or the local clinics? Do we talk about historical trends? And even the HFEA has a large range of metrics to choose from. So even there, it's difficult to know how to compare. We are expected to adhere to standards, and this is the professional diligence. So who makes those standards, and how do we know that we're adhering to them? Now, medical safety and best practice is often regulated, if you like, or advised by the RCOG and NICE. Infection and prevention is the PHE. There are sector-specific rules and regulations by the HFEA or the CQC, and then we've already touched on the medical professional standards of the GMC. So what role does the CMA have in this? We've heard it's not a regulator, but they will no doubt be asked for an opinion on compliance. Should those standards be developed by the BFS, by ESHRE, ASRM? What if they differ? There's a wide variety of international clinical practice. Who's right and who's wrong? Who do we adhere to and who do we not adhere to? Can we use the clinic's own data, evidence-based, peer-reviewed, but not necessarily in common practice? Is that allowable? And where does the HFEA come into all of this? Now, the HFEA add-ons, you would expect me to mention something about that. It seems to be a hot topic, and there are some much better lectures, and I'm not going to go through all the pros and cons of that. But on a personal level, I think the traffic light system is a very narrow view of value, being based on only RCTs and the only evidence of value or quality being live birth. Certainly the most important, but I think arguably there are others. And how does this impact upon research and development? A couple of other things to mention there about routine overtesting. Again, no one would suggest that routine overtesting is a good move, but where does it begin and where does it stop? And referrals to other professionals. Now, we've got to pay. Now, in general terms, unless it's through the NHS, but somebody's paying. Now, patients would normally be expected, the CMA believes that patients should normally be expected to pay for services they've received, but not those where they've not received. That makes absolute sense. But should the risk be transferred completely to the clinic just because they can afford it, or should it be proportionate? I believe it should be proportionate, but the guidance could be interpreted to suggest that the clinic should take on all of that risk. So let's look at a few of those risks in a little bit more detail. So an operator error, for example, resulting in compromise or failure of the cycle, such as incorrect use of media, miscounting of embryos, or not doing the SOP properly, arguably they should be subject to some refund. Clinical or biological error factors such as abnormal response to medication or failed fertilization may be reasonable to refund the bit they haven't had, but not the whole cycle. However, technical or equipment factors or emission or deviations or accidents and incidents, all subject to incidents and complaints procedures, and I would agree that that process should be visible, but not necessarily completely. There should be refunds, but they should be proportionate. If that's the outcome of the incident investigation. Multi-cycle packages we need to give some thought to, because that was highlighted. This is where the financial cost is spread across a population. So someone who is lucky enough to conceive and deliver on their first cycle of treatment arguably hasn't had much of that package, and should they be owed a refund for that which they haven't had? That would clearly be inappropriate because it wasn't the arrangement that we entered into in the first place. So the amount of treatment received will depend upon the clinical outcome. Is that fair for the clinic to be reimbursing everybody back if they haven't had it? Well, there's little point then having the packages in the first place. And I would suggest that if we didn't do that, then it would be some patients gain, some patients lose by the packages, but overall they may decide that that gives them more comfort, and therefore they may opt to have that predictability. And the timescale. It's unfair to restrict timescales. Well, obviously, if that was 3 months to get your 3 cycles in, it's not going to happen. If it's 10 years, that obviously is. But I think probably we need to compromise somewhere in the middle and say that if you haven't completed your package by 2 years, maybe that is the time. That would be an appropriate timescale. But we could welcome some guidance on that. So in conclusion, I think that I understand and agree with the purpose of the CMA's review. It has afforded us an opportunity, or maybe an excuse, to improve our relationship with patients, maybe considering them as consumers, particularly with respect to information provision. But I have some concerns about how we give all that information, as did Raj, and I think sequencing or layering at different times would be appropriate. And I think we have some reservations regarding with what we believe are unintended consequences, and then also how the sector will be monitored against these standards. Thank you.
Now, our final speaker this evening is Katy Lindemann, and Katy is an advocate and commentator on infertility, pregnancy loss and childlessness.
So thank you ever so much for having me on. As I say, I'm a patient and writer, and I've had a lot of treatment myself. I did medications via every conceivable route of administration, and I spent a lot of money on alternative treatments, pretty much every add-on you could imagine. I think the only thing I didn't have was an endometrial stem cell transplant, mainly because the clinic abroad who did it said I wasn't a viable candidate. I spent a lot of money, didn't end up with a baby. Do I think I was ripped off? No, but it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, I'm just going to say, in terms of the question of, do I think I was a patient or a consumer? Fertility is the only area of medicine in the UK where we are purchasing treatment, with the exception of cosmetic surgery and cosmetic dentistry. We do not have a cancer industry. You don't buy multi-cycle packages of chemotherapy with the cost dependent on your prognosis. I have epilepsy. My neurologist does not give me a list of treatments from which to choose like a takeaway menu. But that isn't the case in fertility. So that is why I think we are both patients and consumers in a way that is not true for other areas of medicine, with the exception of cosmetic procedures, which are treating aesthetic concerns, not medical diagnosed impairments of function. So what does it all come down to? This all comes down to informed consent. Now, the CMA have highlighted 4 key areas. I'm going to focus on 3 key areas, which I think are the most important to patients. And it's a really whistle-stop look at what do I think patients are up against? And crucially, what do I think, how might we address these? So first of all, price. So it says clinics should present clear and upfront prices for their treatment. What I want to do is think about, what does clear and upfront prices actually mean from the perspective of the patient? Clinics present information in terms of pricing. What do these products sell for? But as a patient, we actually think of, what am I actually going to pay? Now, again, so the things is, when is a cycle not a cycle? Every actual cost for a patient will vary, but there's some very basic things that what is included in the headline cost of what is a cycle will vary immensely. And I'm talking about a basic no-frills cycle. So there are things that generally are included in a cost. There are things that are not included, but which are mandatory for everyone, that you will always need. There are things that are not generally included, but which are core treatments. So they won't be required for everyone, but they will be required for many or most. So for example, if you have male factor infertility needing ICSI, blastocyst culture, which is not, it is HFEA best practice for single embryo transfer, and embryo freezing. These are all things that you would consider not as add-ons that would be part of NHS treatment. And then you've got optional extras. So what does this actually look like in practice? This is a clinic price list. So when you say price transparency, this is everything that's listed. These are the costs that are laid out. And it says standard cost for all IVF cycles, that's just under £4,000. But if you tot up everything that for a couple with male factor, IVF plus ICSI plus blastocyst culture plus drugs plus the amount of bloods that they say you'll need, and then if you get embryo transfer, embryos to freeze, you are looking at between £8,000 and £9,000 for a treatment cycle. Is it transparent pricing if it is a mathematical exercise to get a true sense of cost? So let's think about that in that way. Okay, so then we're looking at success rates. And as we've seen, this is an absolute minefield in terms of going, how and where do these present? But let's just look at these things from the patient's perspective. Trying to understand clinic success rates should not be a mystery puzzle to try and crack. Now, these are patient websites that have been set up in order to try and decode what are the clinics saying that the clinics are not telling you. Patients, so for example, treatment cycle means a very different thing from very different people in very different contexts. How are patients supposed to compare if we don't know what is meant by treatment cycle, for example? Similarly, patients should not have to be detectives over 3 letters, the difference between per embryo transfer and per embryo transferred. All of this is assuming that you go into a website from the starting point of knowing that on clinic websites you are going to have to navigate either creative accounting or simply that clinics will present information in different ways. It is impossible to compare if you do not even know that clinics are able to present their data in different ways. So that's, these are things that are really complicated. There are things that are very, very straightforward, as has been highlighted. 5 different clinics, these all say they're number one. They're not all number one, don't do it. That's a very simple one. Then we get into add-ons, which I know is a minefield. I personally don't think there is anything wrong with offering add-ons. Where it comes down to, as I've said, is informed consent. Now, so this is where we have an information gap that, we say, we know from the starting point as a patient that clinics are not impartial because they are starting from a point of view of a cell, which is obviously what the CMA is designed to address. So in order to try and, provide impartial information, that's where the HFEA traffic lights came in, which is a fantastic start. It is a really great start, but it is of limited use to patients in the real world, because essentially all it tells us is for everything, it doesn't work, or it might work, but we don't know. It doesn't actually provide us with the information that we need to understand what it is that the clinics are selling to us or offering to us. So for example, they're reliable, but not necessarily especially useful. So what you've had is patients who are trying to fill the gap, and they're creating their own resources. So feeling that we can't necessarily trust clinic websites, and in the absence of useful stuff from the HFEA, we're having to create our own resources. So this is an example that the traffic light system is so light on detail that one couple got so fed up with having to do all of the research that they'd done in order to try and make an informed decision that they created a detailed guide so that if people wanted to find the information, they could. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that it's useful, but isn't necessarily accurate. So where can we get information that is both reliable and useful? Now, at the moment, there isn't any kind of central place that you can go. Probably at the moment, registered fertility counsellors are possibly one of the, the most impartial places you can go for information, but that's not somewhere that you're going to go if you haven't started treatment. And, there isn't a place if you're at the beginning of your journey that you can really get information that is useful, reliable, and impartial. And as I say, this all comes down to informed consent. Now, what does this mean? So at the moment, there is the HFEA Code of Practice, which includes very detailed information about what clinics are supposed to provide. Ultimately, the important bit of that is sufficient, accessible, and up-to-date information, and such relevant information as is proper. But according to who? So the law around informed consent for medical treatment says that it needs to be, what is material information is what a reasonable person in the patient's position would consider important, that they would likely to attach significance. The problem is that we're the ones making the decision, but it's clinics and the HFEA who are deciding what information they think we need and what they think they consider necessary information to make that decision. And therefore, we are the ones who are having to create resources to fill that information gap. So the title of this event is How to Protect Patients in the Fertility Market. The only way to protect patients to do this is to involve patients. Nobody understands what patients need to make informed choices better than patients. There's lots of questions that have been asked saying, is this right? Is this not right? I'm one patient. There's no single right answer. You're not going to be able to do everything that will please everybody, but you cannot adequately protect patients without working with us and getting our input to understand how best to protect us to make informed choices.
So the first question I'm going to go with is one for Louise. This is from an anonymous attendee. A lot of people seem to have chosen to be anonymous this evening. Louise, will the guidance also be relevant for the NHS?
Thank you. Yes, the guidance is, we set out in the draft guidance that the principles and the content of the guidance is relevant to NHS clinics when they provide self-funded treatment. We've heard as part of the consultation process so far that and I should explain the basis of that. The consumer law applies in relation to a relationship between a trader and a consumer. And our working assumption when we published the guidance was that when the NHS is providing treatment directly in accordance with its statutory duties, it's not acting as a trader. We've been told by some stakeholders that the contracting process through the CCGs makes it a more complicated picture than that, and we're considering and reviewing information that people are sent, or stakeholders have sent in relation to that. But our working view at the moment is yes, in relation to self-funded treatment.
Great, thank you for that, Louise. So the next question is for Raj, and perhaps Mark and then Katie want to come in on this. Can you think of any examples where not offering a treatment add-on can be harmful to patients?
I don't know where to start with answering this question. My first thing will be to say that I genuinely think the term add-on has outlived its usefulness, and we can have a discussion about that. The second thing to say is, yes, I think the current dominant system that we have of addressing add-ons is quite a limited way of looking at them, because it looks at one particular outcome, which is live birth. Do I think that there are circumstances in which it is harmful to offer not to offer add-ons to patients? Oh, definitely, yes, I do. There may be outcomes that patients value which are beyond live birth, and in fact, not maybe, there are outcomes that patients value which are beyond live birth. There is this big question of what Louise described as regret aversion, and we haven't actually considered whether regret aversion is something that we should bear in mind, that we should help people deal with. And I think for a number of reasons. Yes, there are situations in which not offering an add-on is harmful to patients. But really, the person who should be answering this is Katy.
So should we go to Katy next and then let Mark have a word?
Yeah, I think it's really true that that regret aversion, and I can speak completely from my own perspective, that actually my doctor said, these are things I don't recommend because I don't think they're evidence based. I went and got them done anyway. I went behind his back. The difference is that I feel that I had informed consent because I knew loads of the things I did. I knew. They said there is no evidence that this works. However, I do think the important thing is that for patients, the question is not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So often, at least from my perspective, and again, this is why having all the information, is that quite often there's the case of going, it's not just what's the evidence. A lot of the thing from the patient perspective is we're going, what's the harm? Because actually there's a thing of going, well, is the evidence that saying there's the evidence that it works? Is it that there isn't any evidence because the research hasn't been done, so we don't know? Is the absence of evidence of absence? So for me, it all comes down to actually having that information and the right information. And I don't think it's even an issue of being able to say, you don't have to bombard it, but it's having that accessible so that patients can get it, because at the moment we can't.
Okay, I think we're in danger of agreeing with each other here, which is always not very good for a debate, but I think it's absolutely accurate. I think patient information is everything. It is also important about when you give that information. There is no point at the beginning of a journey to bombard with the complicated stuff at the very end, because it probably won't be relevant anyway, but it's there. But we are in danger of becoming paternalistic and just deciding when we should offer these things and when we shouldn't. And actually, I don't see any harm in having that information to hand and actually reading about it and digesting it when it's right for the patient, and not necessarily when you think it's the right thing to do.
So I'm going to move on to the next question now, which is one for Louise, and this is from an anonymous attendee again. What are the CMA's enforcement powers, i.e. what could happen if a clinic doesn't comply with the new guidance?
So the CMA is a consumer enforcement, and there are other enforcers of consumer law as well, and their local trading standards principally can take a clinic like it can take other traders to court if they think there's been a breach of consumer law, and we can seek a redress order as part of that for consumers in the collective. Ultimately, it's up to a court to decide whether there's been a breach, but we can take clinics to court.
To follow up on that, perhaps with Claire, what sort of view would the HFEA take on that? How would that fit in with somebody's license?
Well, I think it's important to note that the consumer law that Louise has been talking about is not a law that we are able to enforce. However, if you look in our code of practice, we do currently refer to other pieces of legislation, for example, equality legislation or health and safety legislation. So this work will ultimately be referred to in the same way. So in the same way that when our inspectors visit a clinic and, for example, the fire safety door is not working properly, they might contact the local fire safety trading standards to discuss that, or discuss that with the clinic. So it's something that our inspectors will be alert to, but it isn't our law to enforce. But we'll be very mindful of what we see and what's told to us by patients, and we will certainly refer that to the CMA as and when we need to.
Thanks. And I'm going to stick with you, Claire, because the next most popular question is for you. So if the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act was reviewed, would the HFEA want to have regulatory powers over pricing?
But it's always tempting working with the regulator saying we'd like to have powers over as much as possible. I mean, I think that the areas where the Act at the moment is really out of date is that the things I've talked about to do with consumer protection. I think in relation to other areas that it touches upon tonight. So, for example, if a new treatment is introduced, there's no requirement for it to be safe and effective. It just doesn't have to be unsafe, which in modern medicine is a kind of quite bizarre place to be. And we'd also look at powers relating to future scientific developments and other kind of things like consent and data sharing and anonymity. So I guess to answer the question, it's not necessarily about particular regulatory powers over pricing per se, but about the presentation. I think, as Katy mentioned, that you can go on a website and find that the average price is, I don't know, £3,500 or £4,000. But when you work through the actual treatment that you as a patient might pay, it could be double or triple that. And, you know, we all know of patients who've paid sort of £30,000–40,000 for a single cycle of treatment. And I think this is where, as the regulator, we feel very, very powerless, that it kind of seems a bit unfair, but there's not very much we can do about it.
Katy, would you like the regulator, the HFEA, to have powers over pricing, or perhaps you'd probably rather have powers over what it costs? But anyway, what do you think?
I think it's a really difficult one in terms of, I think this is exactly getting to the nub of it, of going, what is medicine and what is consumers? And I think actually this is, you know, fertility is kind of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to privatized and commoditized medicine, compared to what we have in the, you know, compared to what is in the US. So I think it's something that we need to consider really carefully, because we are coming in. So I don't know what the right answer to that is, but I do think being able to have things that are fair is where we, you know, being able to see what is fair and as a ceiling. Whether that's the HFEA, I don't know, but I do think there is a need to be able to see what is reasonable and what is fair.
Mark or Raj, do you want to come in on this about the potential expansion of the regulator's powers?
I'm not sure that I would vote for that, but as you'd expect me not to. But I can see the point. But on a more serious note about the pricing, I think being in a commercial environment, which we're talking about private clinics and things, no one's going to advertise, do you know what, I'm more expensive than anybody else. But if we had a consistency of pricing, I think that would be absolutely fair. So if we had a format that we could all adhere to be completely transparent, I don't see a problem with that. I mean, for example, most clinics will quote a headline price for IVF, but many now will go to blastocyst, for example, just as a for example, and there's usually an additional cost for that. But that isn't included in the price, because if they did, they would look to be out of sorts with everybody else. And now that's the way things have moved on in the last 5 or 10 years or so with that. That's just one little example. But if there was consistency, I can see that as a good thing, not a bad thing. We don't want to hide stuff. It's just, it may not be commercially in your interest to sort of say, do you know what, I'm more expensive.
Raj?
I think in general, I think for the regulator to have powers to make clinics or even compel clinics to display costs in a uniform way, just as they can be asked to display results in a uniform way, is only a good thing. I don't know if it is practical in late capitalist United Kingdom to have a regulator that controls what you charge patients. I think that is practical, but it is practical, and I think desirable, that we should have a uniform way of displaying costs and a uniform way of displaying success rates, which is understandable to all.
Right, I think we'll move on to the next question, which is from Susan Bewley. Given the normal outcome of pregnancy and the desired one is a healthy singleton and NICE's outcome, why hasn't this become the numerator outcome measure of choice in research and marketing? So she doesn't direct that to anybody, but perhaps as we're still with you, Raj, let's go with you first.
So there has been a lot of debate in reproductive medicine about the best outcome measure for IVF treatments, because different patients value things differently. And there are also cultural differences, I suppose, because, for instance, multiple pregnancy seems to be more of a desired outcome for fertility patients in the US than it is in Europe and the UK. But certainly there is a very strong case to be made for having a healthy singleton as the desirable outcome. In the UK, the HFEA, Clare will tell us more about this, but they carried out an information for quality review a few years ago. And so what is currently the HFEA's preferred outcome of live birth per embryo transferred is the result of that review, which took into account a lot of views across the spectrum, patients and other stakeholders.
I would agree that I think the healthy, a singleton pregnancy statistically is much less risky than a twin pregnancy. So it's a given that you want to have a singleton rather than a twin. And I think that's one of the HFEA successes in actually highlighting this some years ago and setting arbitrary targets at that stage. I think virtually all of us now way below even the target that the HFEA sets now. And I think that's been a great success. And I think that will continue. And I think the default now is an elective single embryo transfer, pretty much in everybody, and really with good explanation as to why you're going to put two back. And that's completely the opposite to where it was 5-10 years ago.
And I think that there's always controversy. I've been in this area far too long about quite what we use for demonstrating success in fertility. Claire, at the HFEA, got any plans to revisit this?
Well, I think, as Raj said, there was a big consultation a few years ago, which is why we've ended up how we are on the HFEA Choose a Fertility Clinic section of our website, where you can compare clinics on various measures, including success rates. I think what we always do try and say to people, and certainly I've had the same experience, Sarah, as you at the fertility show, is that success rates is not the only reason to choose a clinic. There are many other reasons. And actually, oftentimes, either from one year to another or even from one clinic to another, the success rates for you personally are not going to be very different. I think one of the things that came out of the research that the CMA did was that patients feel that often they're told the clinic-wide success rate in that age rather than more personalised information. And I think whatever our website or other websites might provide is a very broad approach. And what we as individuals all want is, what does that mean for me, which can only come out through discussions with the treating clinician.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to move on to the next popular question, which is from an anonymous attendee again, and there are a lot of them out there tonight. So first of all, congratulating Raj on declaring his interests. And then it says, a question for you, Claire, I suspect, because it's, does the HFEA have a view that the GMC, the General Medical Council, should run this as a mandatory register, as recommended by the Cumberledge report, dealing with damaged women patients in other sectors? And if not, why not?
I'm not sure whether if I'm going to answer this in a way that is helpful, but how the HFEA is able to run is to license clinics rather than individual clinicians or other medical professionals. And to have a license from the HFEA, you have to have, as Raj mentioned, someone called a person responsible. That may be a doctor, it may be a nurse, it may be someone else in the clinic. And when it's proposed of someone to take over that role, that has to come to one of the HFEA license committees. And when it does, we review a range of information, including that person's qualifications and experience in this field. We also look at whether they have, whether it's a GMC or other professional registration, GMC and or others, and we do physically check whether there are any restrictions on that registration. So that doesn't really answer the question whether we should hold the register, but I suppose through our registration of clinic licenses and individual persons responsible, we're kind of circling where those people are registered.
Thanks, Claire. So the next question, again anonymous, is to Raj. Do you think that clinicians' commercial interest in generating clinic business, particularly in the private sector, perhaps even receiving bonuses based on the number of consultations converting to IVF treatment cycles, would conflict with the ethical requirements of the GMC registration? So if you want to answer this first, Raj, and then perhaps we'll go to Mark.
Thank you. I don't think it necessarily has to, but I think in certain circumstances it can. And I think all doctors have to reflect on their ethical position and make sure that their behavior is professionally ethical. My personal feeling is that the vast majority of doctors in this field, like other fields, do not set out to take undue advantage financially or otherwise of their patients. I think they all set out to try and do the best job they can for the woman and the couple in front of them. But I think there can be situations where there is an ethical conflict, and I think people have to be very, very careful about that.
Is there anything that you would like to add to that, Mark?
Just really to say that all doctors are registered with the GMC, and the good medical practice is something that we all sign up to, which we have to do. I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, and I think it's and we should be transparent about it. I have no problem with that. If there are, and I think that would come under this sort of review. Really, I think it's transparency and patient information. I think is well within this.
And Katy, I can see you're itching to come in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think there's also important to kind of look at, particularly in the fertility industry where, and I say industry because the amount of clinics that are being taken over by private equity, and even in Australia, there's several clinic groups that are actually floated on the Sydney Stock Exchange. And there was, I remember in one of the financial advisor for people to buy in their pension, it said that, it was a really good stock buy because it was an industry that was recession proof, because there's always going to be patients that want to pay for this. So I think it's probably an important thing to bear in mind that there's clinic management and the clinic who essentially are people who might be owning it and running it as a business, and clinicians. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, because again, clinicians aren't the only ones who are running the clinics and potentially actually setting it as a business and seeing what prices are set. Clinicians are treating patients, but patients are on the receiving end of the clinic. And there is, it is not just clinicians that are involved in that.
Okay, I'm now going to start taking some of the questions that are not from anonymous people, just to mix things up a bit. So we have, it's a question we've sort of covered in one way a little bit already, but it's from Rachel Holdsworth, and it's about what is the most helpful way to present success rates. And I suppose I want to add to that, is there, do we think, am I in cloud cuckoo land, ever going to come a day when all the clinics agree that this is the way we're all going to present them? And this is, within, 1 year, and it's live birth rate per whatever it is. I don't know.
Can I just come in on that, Sarah?
Yes.
I think I've said what the HFEA views is, but I think regardless of which measure is used by the clinic, what is helpful to what years are being included and what age groups, and having that breakdown by year and by age group is really, really helpful for patients. I also think use of colour is quite important. So, you know, you could, to be able to compare one thing with another. So I think that clinic websites are, in some terms of marketing, they're the kind of front door, aren't they, to attract patients, but they're also where patients and others are getting their information from. And that's where I'd urge to kind of have the most amount of information very specifically about age groups and years that are being compared and what sort of treatment types are being compared to enable patients to be able to make that comparison.
And Katie, did you want to add something?
I think it's really interesting that there's other, you know, there are best practice for how to display information. So I know that, you know, for example, there's been work that's done, I think it's by the Harding Centre for Literacy and for the Winton Centre, looking at things like fact boxes and icon arrays. So there is, you know, there is work in wider looking at how to communicate risk and how to communicate success. So I think being able to look at how, you know, what are ways that could be, you know, templates or things that we know are, you know, there is work that's been done around that. So thinking about how we can use some of the research that's been done around ways to display information and ways that are helpful in communicating risk and success to help make informed decisions, I think is important to consider.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, I'm going to move on. Oh gosh. So this is one from Anna Sussman, who is a journalist in the US, and she said she's interviewed loads of infertility patients. In fact, I think she's interviewed me. And she said not only do they discuss regret aversion, as you've discussed now, but they've actively researched and sought out treatments that their doctor didn't suggest, a bit like we heard from Katie earlier, and advocated to have them. And so she was interested if any of you, but she put the question for Raj, know about any psychological component here and whether there's any research on this, i.e. especially given what is known about the placebo effect in other areas of medicine. So I think Raj, if you could deal with that one first.
In relation to the very specific question about the research into the psychological aspects, I'm afraid I don't know of any research specifically into that. I do think, however, that this is actually an under-recognized aspect of treatment because it is not something that can be measured. I think this is a very common phenomenon in clinics across everywhere. Patients do their own research, they go and find options which they then wish to implement, even if their clinician has not told them about it, and actually even if the clinician actively counsels against it. And that is one of the ways in which the whole picture becomes really complicated. And I think we need to understand that complexity rather than reducing this to, or clinics are upselling or overselling or not informing patients properly. It is a lot more complex, and actually that question really goes to the heart of that. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to the specific question about psychological research.
I'm guessing that because nobody's putting their hands up and saying I know, that nobody knows the answer about this, any specific psychological research. I know, Katie.
I know that Jackie Boyvin at Cardiff has done a lot of research into this, and I know that some of the research it's done has found that patients, even when there is a sense of agency, even if you don't have agency, it might not improve your outcomes, but it may improve your ability to cope. Now, again, this comes back to, are people doing this in the knowledge? So it comes back to everything. Are you doing something in the knowledge that you go, I know this isn't necessarily going to work, but I'm doing this because I want to feel that I've ticked every box? In which case, again, that's informed. Or is it that I'm doing this because I think it is going to improve my chance? So again, I come always back to informed consent, informed consent.
Okay, the next question is one for Claire, and this is an anonymous one. Which is, what kind of regulator says clinics are fantastic, etc., but can't call out a lie, as she noted that so many are not the best and highest, as on the 97% non-compliant websites. This is not a bargain between science and the public good. It's regulatory capture where HFEA is a marketing arm. and they're thanking the CMA for stepping in. And I do feel that we need to ask Louise more questions. But Claire, can you answer this one, please?
Thanks, Sarah. So I should just clarify that 90% non-compliant was about covering all the information on clinic websites. It wasn't about clinics being non-compliant in general. I think that as the regulator, we have to be careful about painting everyone with the same brush. And I think, as everyone has said tonight, most people who work in any area of medicine are always acting in the patient's interest. And I think it would be really disingenuous as the regulator if I said that most people who work in the fertility sector do not have the patient's interest at heart. However, having said that, as Louise and others have noted, people are paying a lot of money and making some very difficult decisions, and not everyone is happy with what's happened during their treatment, regardless of whether they've had a successful outcome or not. Some research we did in 2018 on a national patient survey found that over 75% of patients, whether or not they came home with a baby, felt they had been treated well by their clinic. Now that's great, but there's 25% of patients who are not very happy with what went on. When our inspectors go into clinics, they look into a huge range of things, from whether the controlled drug controlled drug cases key is kept in a safe place, to whether consent's taken properly and what's happening in the lab. And I think we need to be very careful. We publish all our inspection reports. Every patient, everyone here can see them on our website. And I'd encourage people to do their research. We have to be careful about saying that everyone is in this for bad reasons, because that's not what I don't think anyone at the HFEA would say, but it is up to us to call out bad practice where we see that. And you can see that through all the publications on our website, where we say exactly what we see when we inspect clinics every 2 years.
Thanks for taking that question, Claire. Now, we're at 7 o'clock, and people will know that I like to finish things exactly on time, but I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and go for another few minutes. So if people will indulge me, because I wanted to ask Louise a question and I found one in the list. So this is from Richard Hurley. Does the draft guidance mean that IVF packages would be outlawed, as Mark Wilcox seemed to suggest?
No, we don't say anything that, I think Mark might have misinterpreted what we say in the guidance in relation to multi-cycle packages. Could I come back on a...
Could I just on that? No, I wasn't suggesting that they would be banned. It was just that there may be unintended consequences of some of the wording, and I didn't believe that was the case, that we should be doing. It is a different way to pay, in different circumstances. It's no more or no less. It's just evened out across a group. So there's no financial benefit in having these packages. It's just the same. So I would argue that they should be there, but I was just suggesting that it may be difficult with some of the wording.
Louise, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, just on a couple of quick points in relation to a few points that you said. Our report, or the research that we commissioned with patients, covers regret aversion, and that's available on our website if the lady that had the question that wants to have a look at that. It doesn't really get into the psychological dimensions of it, but it does talk about the different ways that patients reflect on that. On success rates, I just wanted to make one quick point, that while there are various legitimate ways of presenting success rate information, and different patients want different things, and there are legitimate ways that clinics present information differently, there are also examples of clinics deliberately cherry picking particular success rate information, which isn't about just different legitimate ways of presenting it. For example, focusing only on blastocyst transfers to make their success rates bigger, or picking out a particular clinic if they're part of a group to make that point. And I want to abuse my position now speaking and say there is still plenty of time to input into the consultation process. And if Raj, I know you haven't submitted collectively a response as the BFS, but if you want to organise a small group and we can discuss things as as a number of different members of the organisation, we're very happy to do that. If anyone wants bilateral conversations, and patient groups, patients, everybody's welcome still to submit responses. We've still got a number of months before we finalise the guidance, and we're reflecting on all the submissions we've had and what we've heard in terms of the stakeholder events very, very carefully at the moment.